So you're probably wondering if the new RPM is actually hashtag not the RPM, hashtag but it's still the RPM, right? Well, we were wondering the same question. So this week I made my way down to Orlando, Florida to link up with one of Matt Kite's original team riders, Steve Lee. Now, Steve was one of the first guys in our area to actually boot up a kiteboard and start riding wake style. He's also got more experience at the cable park and on the Fuel C kite than anybody else that I know. So he seemed like the perfect candidate to link up and just test the new kite. If I had to sum up the new RPM in 3 words, it would be smooth, consistent, and grunty, but that doesn't even begin to tell the whole story. So this week, we're going to do a complete roast of the new RPM. Let's get to it. So Slingshot's hyping up the new RPM pretty hard, and the question that we're all wondering is, what can you expect from the new RPM? How does it differ from the old RPM? And is Slingshot fixing something that's not broken just to get this kite back on our radars? Heads up guys, I know you know by now to click the eye icon in the upper right hand corner of your screen. There you can open up the full written review in a new tab and give that a read after you finish this video. Steve and I also made a bonus video log behind the scenes of our trip where we tested the RPM at the 520 Slick in Cocoa Beach. So don't forget to give that a click and open that up in a new tab, and you can finish that after this video review. We'll tackle this review point by point on the various aspects of the kite, starting with the wind range. So the first thing that popped out when we were testing the new RPM is it does have a larger wind range. We all knew the old RPM thrived in the mid to high end of its wind range, and it was a very reactive kite that liked to be powered up. So with the original RPM, we would have to sign the kite to generate some more board speed and power out of the kite. Whereas with the new RPM, it was a larger, broader, more consistent and powerful power stroke, and we didn't really have to sign the kite as much. Now I wouldn't say that it matches the low end of the rally, but it's a lot closer in this regard. So what this means for you is you can get more water time with the same size kite with the new RPM. With the original, you would have to fly it a bit more like a crossover freestyle kite where you'd sign it aggressively, and with the new RPM, it takes a wider, broader, more arcing turn, and it flies a lot more like a free ride kite. So when you have gusty wind or holes in the wind, you're going to be able to power through those pretty effortlessly without really having to do anything with the kite. So what about jumping? Now just to give a disclaimer here, I'm not the kind of reviewer just to tell you that a new kite is better just because it's new. Actually, Matt Kite carries the old RPM and the new RPM, so my aim here is really just to give you a better idea of what you're getting into so you can make your choice and decide between the two kites. Now with that said, the new RPM, it does jump better. So we all knew the original RPM wasn't exactly famous for jumping. It took a little bit more timing, you really had to pull the trigger at the right moment, and if you wanted to get lofty air, you really had to pull the bar in and hold it all the way to stay up there. If you released a bit, the kite would actually start dropping you sooner than you would expect from your standard freeride kite. Not a big deal at all if you're used to it, somewhat annoying if you're used to freeride kites like the Duotone Evo or the Slingshot Rally. I've said this before, but the RPM of any year is a more user-friendly version of the crossover freestyle kites that we see like the FX or the Dice, but definitely much more in the freeride direction, and with this newest model it's taken yet another step in the freeride direction. The new RPM actually has an autopilot-like feel, and the jumping is effortless. The jumps are smoother, loftier, and you don't have to pull the bar in all the way to stay up in the air. Now with the new RPM, you can expect a more autopilot-like feel and a more forgiving kite, but don't mistake that for a less direct kite. When it came to hooked-in tricks and jumps, I've never had more fun on the RPM. Between the easier jump, the consistent feedback, and the good stable bar pressure, I always knew where the kite was mid-jump or mid-roll. So final thoughts on jumping. Each kite caters to the same rider, but with a different approach. The new RPM is like the old RPM, but it's a little more friendly to newer riders or weekend warriors. Meaning, a skilled rider could get just as much air on the old RPM, but it's a lot easier and something like 10% loftier on the new RPM. So what about stability? Well, this is another point where the new RPM is more stable. In gustier winds, the kite had a lot less flutter, it was much more controlled, and the new low end was very, very beneficial when out there and testing the kite in some turbulent winds. And we were actually testing this at the 520 Slick, where there is an open part of the road where the wind gets nice and smooth, but when you get back by the mangroves, it actually creates turbulence. And when we were in this turbulent wind, the kite handled the gust really, really well compared to the old RPM. So you might be noticing a trend here, and that is that the RPM, the original RPM, is the original crossover freestyle kite. And what I mean here is it shares many of the traits that I often talk about when discussing kites like the Dice or the FX, kites that require a little more rider feedback. All that said, the RPM was always more user-friendly and a little more free ride than those kites. So what about kite surfing in the waves? Now obviously the RPM of any generation is not going to work the same as any kite made specifically for riding in the waves, but both of these kites are somewhat all-around kites and they do both work in the waves. You will, however, have to modify your style. Here's what I mean. So the original RPM by no means was a wave kite, but it was one that I personally enjoyed in the waves as it was fast, it would loop if you blinked at it, you could really charge into good sections of the wave if you needed to. It lacked that low end, so you didn't really ever get pulled off the waves with this kite. So all that said, this wasn't exactly a performance wave kite, but it worked really well in medium to small waves, and I had a lot of fun with it. I did, however, notice that occasionally when you drop this kite in wave-like conditions that it did have a tendency to invert itself or roll over, and it wasn't always the easiest kite to relaunch in wave conditions. Now with the new RPM, you're going to have to use this in the waves like your standard freeride kite, meaning wider, smoother turns, you won't have to be as active with the kite. It is a stronger kite and it does have more pull. So a little tip here is with a new RPM, you might want to just size down when you're going out in the waves to get a better experience, and then you'll have a faster kite. You won't have as much low end when you're on the waves, and it will be a better tool there. All that said, neither one of these kites are specialty wave kites, so you would be better served with like an SST or a drifter or any of the other wave kites. One final thought on the waves is the new RPM. It does have an improved relaunch, so you can drop it in the waves with a little more confidence. So what about kite looping with these kites? Now, the old RPM was known to be a really good kite for kite looping, and with the new RPM, this still holds true, albeit the timing is a little bit different. It's more of an arcing, more consistent power band now. So I remember on the older RPM, a lot of times I would go out and do scent jumps, and it was almost like I could just loop the 10 mid-roll with my hand just on the center of the bar, and it would just very, very quickly loop. It wasn't a very powerful loop, at least in the conditions that I was taking that 10 meter out in. Whereas with the new RPM, it's it's a gruntier kite. It has more pull to it now, and I don't want to say that it's more delayed, but the timing is just a little bit different. You have to pull the trigger maybe just a little bit earlier. All that said, I always have admitted that I'm not exactly the greatest at kite looping, so I am going to not go into great detail on this point. I do, however, encourage our viewers to chime in on this subject. So if you're somebody who kite loops and you've been looping the old RPM, you've tested the new RPM, go ahead and just leave a comment. And as well in the written blog, I will make a point to talk to some other people, and we'll get some opinions on looping the new RPM, and we will put that in the written blog. So what about unhooking? Now I'm sure many of you that flew the original RPM are wondering about this point, and the product video was almost a little confusing as they talked about how the new RPM has a deeper C, making it seem like it took a step towards the fuel, yet all the points we've discussed kind of point that this kite has gone more in the freeride direction, and while it has, that's not exactly the case. So the direct, even, consistent bar pressure did actually feel more like a fuel. And while it now does have all of the user-friendly traits of all-around freeride kites, it's still equally as good at unhooking as many of the crossover freestyle kites like the FX or the Dice, albeit it's a smoother, softer, more consistent pop. So when it comes to unhooking, this is kind of an interesting point. We found when testing the kite that when you're riding in the wind range that it's recommended for and you're not overpowered, it does kind of perform almost like a crossover freestyle kite. It's not quite as explosive, but it's very consistent and very smooth, and it did make handle passes easier, and it made unhook riding really fun. Now, when you start to get overpowered on this kite, this is where it gets kind of funny. Once you're in the higher end of the kite's wind range, not necessarily overpowered, but just pushing the high end of the kite's wind range, what happens is it starts to take on the characteristics of almost like a rally or a switchblade. And what I mean here is you're going to have to modify your style a little bit. So you might find that you get stretched out a little bit during some of the tricks, and you're going to have to rotate a bit more to land blind or do any handle passes. So what I mean here is, most of the time, you can expect this kite to perform like a user-friendly crossover freestyle kite. However, when the wind gets a bit stronger and you're pushing the kite on the high end of its wind range, you just have to modify your style and treat it a bit more like a freeride kite, meaning you're going to have to muscle through some of those passes and you're going to have to land more downwind on your tricks. Now, one of the reasons that this kite is so good with its unhook performance is the load shift technology. And normally I would try to not use a marketing buzzword like this, but this was something that we really liked about the kite. Now don't be mistaken, the old RPM, it does have many world titles under its belt, And even though it was a very advanced freestyle kite, it's something we actually taught with at our school here. We always had a quiver of RPMs in our lesson center, and many students learned on this kite. So in summary here, the original RPM was the first of its kind. It was the original crossover freestyle kite. And while many riders did learn to ride on it, it really did lead the charge for this new category, yet it never really got caught up in all the hype. At the end of the day, and having been around so long, everybody was getting bored of it, and there really was nothing wrong with the RPM. So all that said, does the new RPM live up to the hype? Yes, it does. Did Slingshot redesign this to get it back on your radar? Yes, they did. And just a heads up guys, I'm going to purposefully make these videos a little shorter and include more information in my write-up. So if you'd like to get more insights on this kite, you will want to give that a read through after this video. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. If you've already subscribed, go ahead and hit the bell icon in the same place and you'll receive a notification every time we drop a new video. So until next time, this has been Rygo and I'll catch you on Versus.